Well, thank you. I appreciate everyone coming this morning, and I wanted to get a little bit of understanding for where everyone's coming from in the room, and find out if there's any of the people here who have a family member who are undiagnosed themselves. So there are quite a few of you. I know it's certainly not as unusual as probably most people kind of outside of this room might think, and certainly a long journey. So just a bit of background about me. As mentioned, I'm on the board of Global Genes. I kind of wear many hats at this point. Professionally, I've been involved in the biotech industry for about 25 years, spent 11 years on Wall Street evaluating biotech companies, and then the last 11 or 12 years as an executive in various public and private biotech companies. So this is an area I've been involved with long before being involved in the rare disease area. My husband also I met when I was an analyst. He's works at the largest biotech company. And so I'm very familiar with this. So it's sort of ironic that we should end up with a child with a rare disease, and maybe even more so that it should take so long to actually get to a diagnosis. And I think that probably maybe puts things into a little bit of context as far as how difficult this is really for anyone, no matter kind of who you know, where you are. We live in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley and all of that, and it still proves to be a long and difficult journey. So this is kind of a classic tale. In 2005, our first child, James, was born. Greg and I met in March of 2003. We got married in March of 2004. James was born in March of 2005. Things were, humming right along. We were taking selfies before the Kardashians made it popular, and everything was great. It was a very easy pregnancy. His APGAR scores were 9, so everything was going along just swimmingly. Until, as many of you have probably been in this situation, something unexpected happens. And in the case of James, after about 12 hours after he was born, the nurse noticed that he was having seizures. And I've never been around babies, infants really at all. I was the younger of 2 siblings, never really babysat. So I had no idea what was going on, but he was immediately whisked away to the ICU and starting a big battery of tests for everything, CT scans, testing for anything that might be related to early onset seizures. Going through our own family health histories, of which there's no background really of anything at all related to this. So it was a complete shock, being on pain medication and for a C-section, and all of this going on. A bit of it's kind of a blur. The nurses wanted to know if my husband thought I needed sedatives, but obviously it's as we all know, a very upsetting situation. And at that point, not really knowing, what might be the outcome, whether he would live beyond this, having 20 seizures or so each day. So leading up to this is his first birthday. I've tried to just do this with pictures, and hopefully I can remember everything that I wanted to say about how this went along. Once we got out of the hospital, they got his seizures under control with high doses of phenobarbital. They thought, okay, we're out of the woods. We tested for a lot of things. All the results were normal. That this was just a benign early infantile spasms, something that apparently is not that uncommon. And once the tests they ran were all negative, I think most physicians think they know how to choose the test, what to do. So this must be his only problems with the seizures. So once those were controlled, we were released from the hospital after about 10 days with the, at that point, good news that it was just some form of epilepsy and it might likely reside. About a month later, his seizures got out of control again. We're back for more tests and finally got the seizures under control. But with each round of tests over those months, Every time when everything came back normal, that was the good news that yes, it confirmed their diagnosis. He just had this seizure disorder. And that was certainly something that we could easily live with, manage throughout his life if necessary, if it didn't resolve on his own. But by the time he turned 1, generally healthy looking, he could do a baby food ad, ate well, slept well, but he was missing his milestones. And maybe in hindsight it was our own denial and wanting to think everything was okay. And I'm sure probably some of you have been through that. When the physician said that it was probably because of the high doses of seizure medications that were slowing him down, that was certainly comforting to think that maybe things were still going to come out okay. And so as he turned 1 though, and was not sitting up well, was not walking, was not talking, we started on kind of another round of testing as well as multiple therapies to try to get things going along. So as he turned 2, over that course of that year, busy with a few things. In March of 2006, his younger sister was born. Obviously, by that time, we had some concerns over how that might affect, how whatever he had might affect her, as we knew, starting to think it might be something more significant. It wasn't a concern, before earlier, since they said it was just a seizure disorder. But that obviously came into play at that point, and certainly that was a distraction from actively pursuing a lot of testing. And it's interesting hearing everyone's kind of personal approach to, and I think it depends on what the individual symptoms are of how aggressively they pursue things at the cost to the rest of their life. We had a happy little boy with seizures under control, and we're told that everything had been tested for. So kind of went into periods of lulls in between, which in hindsight, there were certainly more things we could have done, but we were living a life and moving on. But by the time he was 2 and things were, he was still lagging further and further behind, we started getting more and more active and pursuing more testing. But still, even at that point, it's amazing what people kind of outside of your world see. I don't know how many people, I hadn't even known this fact before. Apparently Einstein didn't talk until he was 3. And that James was right on his path to being like Einstein. So and it's just, the things that, other people want to believe and you want to believe. And so we kind of vacillated in and out of these aggressive periods of testing. So, when he turned 3, we were started doing, a lot more testing, pursuing other institutions outside of the Bay Area. We'd been going to UCSF and Stanford. We started looking to Johns Hopkins and Harvard and using our connections in the industry to try to come up with other tests to run. And this, now with the kind of obvious answer of doing, whole genome sequencing and things like that, at this time it was one-off testing. And people would say it's an insurance company thing, but at that point it's amazing how far the technology's come. It was homebrew test at that point as we got to more and more obscure disorders that we were evaluating, of sending off samples to individual academic research labs. The guy in Colorado who does the test for this disorder. And in James's case, when we went back and started scrutinizing his medical records, he had an incidence of a high glutaric acid level in his urine at one point. And based on his other symptoms, it was determined he probably had glutaric acidemia 1 or GA1, which kind of inconveniently mostly occurs in the Amish. There's about 50 Amish in the US who have it, most of whom are not on the internet. And we're not, we didn't fit into that group, but the doctors were convinced he had it, so James immediately went on a low protein diet, because in that disorder you can't break down tryptophan and lysine, like the turkey things. And we, bread has too much protein, depending on which kind of bread you buy. It's very low proteins and replaced with a formula. And so for about almost 9 months, we did this low protein diet under this assumption while we waited for this homebrew test to come back from an academic lab to see if he actually was expressing a mutation in that gene. So then enter, this is not a paid promotional ad, but enter Global Genes, which Nicole and team came up with this idea in 2008. And I think a lot of our stories and successes, luck plays into this a lot, but through friend of friend in the industry, got invited to a little gathering at someone's house in San Francisco as Nicole was floating this idea out for having this patient-focused rare disease organization. And this was really what I'd been looking for. I didn't have a group. That's one nice thing about having a diagnosis. You have other people you can commiserate with, get ideas from, learn from, get support from, and we didn't have that. And that may in part be the reason, part of the reason for our winding journey, along this of stops and starts, because certainly when I, make events like this or in connection with other people in the rare disease community, you certainly get inspired that, you should be driving full force to getting, answers, getting cures, treatments, et cetera. But in 2008 became connected with Global Genes, joined the board, and this became, our community, thinking that we may indefinitely not have, any type of a diagnosis. So he turned 4. I think my mother-in-law made the green and brown cupcakes. I'm not sure about that choice, but we had started connecting with a lot of new people around Global Genes. Had new ideas for testing to pursue, because as you can see, he is chronically happy. There's a whole series of disorders, which I don't know if they can find some way to manipulate that gene, like Angelman's, where many of the patients are amazingly happy. I think we all need a little variant of that, but that was one line of thinking. And then we moved down closer to Stanford, and the geneticist we saw there is an expert in mitochondrial disorders. So, one learning out of this is, when you have a hammer, everything's a nail. Of course, James ended up, must have a mitochondrial disorder. We started the Mito Cocktail and the theory that, well, why not? It doesn't hurt, it's a bunch of vitamins, the insurance was paying for it. He didn't really care for it, but for 3 years, he took that thinking a probable mitochondrial disorder, just one that hadn't been discovered yet, but not able to identify, anything in particular. When he was 5, we'd had literally hundreds of tests. Sequencing really wasn't generally available, and we were still undiagnosed. And really by that point, as I'm sure some of you have gone after years of looking, feeling you've done every test, that's your category, you're undiagnosed. And we started getting involved with groups like Symptoms Without a Name and In Need of Diagnosis and other undiagnosed groups, as well as still being active with Global Genes. Started lobbying for legislation on the Hill for undiagnosed disease registries, working with parents of children both alive and deceased who had undiagnosed disorders. And really this was kind of the end of our road in a way, or at least so we thought. The geneticists said they couldn't think of anything else to test for. That was where we were at that point in this undiagnosed category. And ironically, for all that we had been through by that point, it was amazing how many people we would meet, who knew our backgrounds and knew his condition generally, said, oh, well, have you had him tested? It's like there's a test. And I think that's one certainly out there, a misconception that because people are familiar with very typical diseases that millions of patients have, where there's a test for diabetes or there's a test for cholesterol and things like that, and you read out a number and that's the answer. And that for most of us it's not that kind of a process, and not even that kind of result when there is a test. So it was, I would get asked that, well, have you had him tested? Like, no, I didn't notice he, is 5 and can't talk and barely walking. What a great idea. I'll go get that done. In 2011, we were kind of back to the holding pattern. Couldn't think of anything else to test for. He was very stable. And so, just kind of going on with life. We'd adopted another child, and not pictured there. But kind of life going on, and we weren't really sure, what to do at that point. in 2012, his health really took a turn for the worse. That's why there's two pictures here. He didn't make it to the initial birthday celebration because he was passed out after a seizure. A few days before his birthday, he had a massive seizure conveniently in the Stanford waiting room, waiting for an MRI. So that was the upside, but started for the next several months having 10 plus seizures every day, grand mal seizures, after being very well controlled for years. He made it, that was the replay, that's the back half of the cake with candles on it, that we had the leftovers. But at that point, we ended up having to figure out, well, is there anything else we could do? And we're able to get into the NIH Undiagnosed Diseases Program, which for anyone familiar with that, it's a long, kind of arduous process. You have to demonstrate that you've kind of expended all of your options, that your doctors have said they tested for everything they can think of, all of that, and became one of, I think, about 100 patients accepted into that program in 2012. So there he is. He wasn't sure about it, and the head nurse there, of what they were doing to him. It's lots of a week of poking and prodding, and mostly clinical tests at the NIH, muscle biopsies, nerve conduction studies, MRIs, EEGs, all sorts of cardiovascular tests. And probably the best thing out of that whole experience, because he had a complete top to bottom scrub down, since he is was at that point undiagnosed, of finding out that there wasn't anything kind of hiding or latent that we didn't know about. Because with an undiagnosed disease, and certainly even with many rare diseases where you don't have a lot of patients, where really the entirety of what's involved in the disorder, maybe he did have, some little hole in his heart or something that was going to turn up later that we just hadn't discovered yet and hadn't come to a level of clinical significance. So, even though kind of ultimately this was, I guess you could consider it a bust, they didn't find any diagnosis for him despite that. But, it certainly provided a lot of peace of mind that we were seeing what we were seeing. There wasn't something hiding that we were missing under the surface. Yes?
Did you go to Children's National?
Yeah. So the question was, did we go to Children's National? Yeah, we went to Bethesda, and now that's being expanded. The NIH Undiagnosed Diseases Program is being expanded to other clinical centers. But at that point, it was strictly the primary program run out of the NIH in Bethesda. And so, we felt very fortunate to be, accepted into it, and certainly did provide some benefit, even though it didn't lead to a diagnosis. But in 2012, 7 years after James was born, this gene, the KCNQ2 gene, was discovered. We didn't know it. As many of those things, it's not like it makes the front of the New York Times, but and it's this gene that codes for a structural protein on the surface of the potassium channel, which is part of neurons. So it controls, and many of you who may have related diseases are probably familiar with this, but controls the signaling of the brain and throughout the body of those impulses. So affects all of the systems, and in some ways, some of the effects are much like the seizures themselves, just at a much lower level. But that was discovered in 2012. So when you look back at everything that we did, this wasn't even well characterized as something that caused this sort of disorder. And so, with all that going on, James turned 8 in 2013, still undiagnosed. We're still recycling the same party hats. I learned you can use a brownie mix to make something that looks like a cake. But things were going along, and while we were still involved in trying to find a diagnosis, we hadn't been aware of that, and I'm not sure that enough was known at that point. The paper was on just a small number of children, whether it would have been apparent that he had exactly that because of the wide array of different presentations depending on the exact mutation. So in 2013, we finally got a diagnosis just before James's next birthday at TGen, and that just kind of shows the power of all the connections with everyone through Global Genes. Was aware of TGen, heard about a program they were doing at their Center for Rare Childhood Disorders, in doing sequencing, and not just doing that sequencing, but having experts in these rare disorders and rare neurological conditions, and we're able to get finally that diagnosis. And I think getting a diagnosis to us was a huge relief. We kind of knew what all of James's symptoms were. We knew what his issues were. So being able to know what was causing it, how his brain was working or not working well, and then finally having a target of something we could start working towards and doing was great. But I think for those that saw Mariana Polka's film last night and her comment, you're looking for an answer and you end up with a lot more questions. And I mean, that's certainly true with, I think, a lot of this, but in our case, and I think for many people who've been on this journey, that getting a diagnosis, it's not like finding out one day that you have cancer. I mean, you're happy to now have something to work on and maybe improve the condition. So shortly after that, James turned 9. And we formed with some other parents. Those are 2 other of the 3 other parents. There's 4 of us on the board of the KCNQ2 Cure Alliance, which is a foundation that we formed, a 501c3, with one of the parents from Australia, and involvement really with patients throughout the globe. Scotty Sims on the left hand of that picture had already, as a social worker, had already formed a Facebook support group, which we now have up to about 150 patient families represented in our Facebook group, and we're able to start reaching out to many other families, because as the gene was discovered and characterized in 2012, more and more people were getting diagnosed, and ended up having our first professional and family summit in last fall in October. And as you can see, most of the children are pretty young. James, now 10, is one of the oldest, and I think that kind of goes to some of the diagnostic journey and people really tiring of the process. That most older kids were well along that journey before the gene was well characterized, before the genome sequencing was available in order to discover this. And so now you have lots of infants and younger children being diagnosed with this who are still in the hospital, still in that process. But there's certainly not the kind of even distribution of patients, and this disease is not progressive. We've had a few children that have passed from complications from seizures, but to have one of your older patients at 10, there's obviously getting a diagnosis is a big obstacle for there being a lot more patients in this category. But hugely successful first event that was enabled by this, and had about 6 top thought leaders, researchers from around the world, and a lot of families coming in. For many of the researchers, this was their first time of seeing certainly more than one patient, and the patients have a wide variation, and understanding really kind of what this disease meant, what kind of treatments might be needed, and something just beyond their lab. We had an awareness week in the first week of March, last March, with a number of our families, and some of this you almost feel it's a fake it till you make it, or one of those things. It's there was a couple of us at our laptops making up like campaign materials and tweeting and website stuff, that like pretending we're some organization, and when we're just getting this going. But I think we have already been able to gain a lot more attention for this and interest from the research community, and work towards a treatment, and certainly providing support and information to the families. So this year, James turned 10. That's with all of the siblings, and Anna from Frozen there in the middle. But just to kind of cull this down into something that might be useful, and not just kind of hearing about our story, and when I look back on it, of what some of the takeaways, and these are just kind of a little stream of consciousness of taking control. I mean, there's certainly a lot of that we didn't do. I'm not, I won't claim to be the poster child for going out there and having an orderly process and test. And it's sort of ironic that the people that are supposed to be managing this process are the same people that have a sick or disabled child they're supposed to be caring for and probably the least able to manage a process like this. Certainly, we had the resources, but, to think of what tests were done when James was born, and that, in my drug-induced haze and, the stress of the situation, trying to identify, here's the test I think that should be done, calling people that might be experts. We weren't fully managing the situation, and maybe at that moment that wasn't possible. I mean, probably the best thing that we did was to say, if there's anything with a treatment, test for it immediately, because you can't test for everything, but at least if there's anything with seizures that's severe that might have a treatment that we could get going on, to do that immediately and kind of triage down from that. But we picked really good experts in the field and just presumed that they were making the choices of what was being tested for appropriately or pushing it aggressively enough. And that probably wasn't always the case. So doing a lot more of our own research probably would have sped things along, though we did at that point, technology wasn't quite there. Certainly collect all the medical information in one place. I, being from the finance side of things, and big in Excel spreadsheets, and that was where I put every test he did, and just for ease of use, I'll sort them alphabetically. The test, the date, the outcome, not just positive or negative, but the lab, ranges of whether it's in and out of normal kind of ranges, because if there's any little clue of something to identify of, oh, these kind of run high, or even if they're in a normal range. So test of the genetic test, the blood work, head circumference, weight, if there's anything that might provide a clue. I mean, they always said his head was kind of big. That's a family trait. Or, but they're all the things, and I know anyone that's gone through this of measuring the width of your eyes and something about your fingers and your palms and all those things, but of any kind of little data points like that, of having that all in a spreadsheet, because you end up with mountains of data. I found it sort of ironic. We have a service dog, and I brought him to the vet, and he's got this ear infection again, and the vet says, oh, you come in every April. He must have seasonal allergies. He gets an ear infection every April. And it's like, well, the dog that never comes in, you can see those patterns because it's just such a small amount of data. But when you start doing all this testing and have all these mountains of data, and it's mostly transcribed in some verbiage, you can't pick out those kind of points. And so that was huge. I know there's some commercially available programs now, but that's what worked for us. Networking, that made all the difference in meeting people, getting ideas of what to test for, who had a child that was similar. And that really goes to getting your story out there. I know some people may disagree with this. I feel like HIPAA and some of that is for people that aren't really sick. That, if you're worried people might find out you have this disorder, anyone that sees my son will know that he has a significant disorder. For people who are really sick, you're not fooling anybody by not releasing your medical information. And maybe it's my own bias of coming from the biopharmaceutical industry. I can't imagine what kind of untoward thing industry could do with your data. If they're working in your disease area, that could only benefit you. You don't necessarily want them to own your data, but knowing about you, hearing about you, knowing the condition, and sharing that information can only help make connections and help people learn more about what might be needed to help patients like yours. In terms of science, I said it's not as scientific as you think. That gets back to did you get tested? There's a test, and even with sequencing, it's not spitting out an answer. There's companies being formed. One I'm actually working with, commercial enterprises, that their whole business model is around trying to better evaluate and organize the output from sequencing, so that journal articles don't use the same language in their text. And so if it talks about certain symptoms or certain phenotypes with a certain gene, it won't necessarily get picked up if they use different language like epilepsy instead of seizures, because it's not recognized. So there's manually curated databases that have been licensed that people upkeep now to try to tie that into the genetic information. But it depends on what doctor you talk to, who read what journal article, which week, what they test for. And it's funny, it's almost like there's clubs of, oh, these guys went to school together. It doesn't matter if you see the guy at Stanford and at Harvard because they trained together and they're going to say the same thing. So, there's all the things that are kind of politics and just regular social behavior that play into it. I mentioned before, if you have a hammer, everything's a nail. Again, another reason to talk to as many people as possible to get these varied opinions and people not just treating the disease or seeing the disease that they're an expert in. Keep searching, and I caveat that with as long as it doesn't affect the quality of life. I mean, there's some tests I know people don't want to do, if you have to do muscle biopsies, if it's particularly painful and low probability. And we certainly went through those ups and downs, but I don't think that there is an end of the road. And I'd add here my one other kind of hot button issue is about what counts as a diagnosis, when you really are at the end of that road, because now with more information, there's phenotypic diagnoses, which are essentially a description of symptoms. Historically, those were the disease is named after some guy that discovered it. And that's, it's interesting hearing about what the research that was described yesterday in autism for the causes. Autism is a description of symptoms. They're looking for the cause. In our area with KCNQ2, many of the patients had been diagnosed with Ohtahara syndrome, which is basically a description of a bunch of symptoms, or West syndrome. But when you're thinking of disorder, that's true of a lot of people with cerebral palsy. I have a friend with a son with polymicrogyria, which is small nodules on the brain, essentially. But if you have to ask yourself why do I have this? Why does my child have this? Then that, to me, that's not a diagnosis. If you can't say, as in we can, well, when the cells were dividing, there was this error and it caused this mutation. That's why he has these symptoms. And I think until you have some root cause, I think it's a lot more difficult to start looking for a treatment. But there's certainly so many people out there who consider themselves diagnosed who, at least from my thinking, don't have that diagnosis of why do you have these collection of symptoms that has this historic doctor's name on it. And that's where the science keeps advancing. We were searching for the first half of this journey for something that was really not findable, the needle in the haystack, and it wasn't even really there. And we certainly didn't have the tools for it. And then, the no treatment is no excuse. I've certainly talked to a lot of people who said, well, there's no reason to we've tested for everything that has a treatment. There's no reason to keep testing because what would we do any differently? How would we, treat, our family member any differently if we had a name for this? And I think it's certainly nice to understand. It certainly was helpful for us to know what was going on inside our son's head. Comforting to know for his other siblings, and also that as a lot of this conference is around of what we can do to advance those treatments, because someone's got to take that leadership role and be part of finding those solutions. And this may be overreaching beyond where our diagnostic journey ends, but certainly the things we've done since we've had a diagnosis, connecting with other families, even if there are no treatments, as I said, the knowledge is power. The community really needs leaders. There's so few people that are able to, take that on given their circumstances of caring for people with these diseases. And so any ability to do that and join people together, or at least, even if you can gather that Facebook group that then people can, identify out of that who can take on the roles. And really learning from other patient groups. There's global genes, but there's also, I know in our community, since we have a relatively new gene, working with similar disorders, like the Dravet patient group, or also kind of going under other groups like the Epilepsy Society, since this is a fundamentally, a very severe form of epilepsy. And start laying out plans. I think, as with everything, and I thought this about, people planning careers, planning my own career, if you've got to just do something, when you get out of college and you're like, well, I'm going to go and be president of this or whatever, you've got to just start by getting a job. And then you can figure it out from there while you start, earning some money and finding out what you like and you don't like. And I think this is a little bit like that. I mean, you can attend these conferences and you can try to lay out best practices, but at some point you just have to get going on doing something. And so just, an example of some of the things we've done, I'm certainly very proud of what we've been able to accomplish in the last, not quite a year since we founded our organization, and a lot of that carried by some of the other families. Where we had our first summit last year. We're planning our second summit in a few weeks. Lots more families coming. We have about 10 experts coming. We also have people who are experts in various kinds of therapies, occupational physical therapies, and things that apply to our kids. We have a sibling workshop. So a number of things that that we think that will be helpful to our community. We also have opportunity for scientific meetings, the scientists to collaborate with each other. And we've also been able to attract some interest from pharmaceutical companies and investors who are interested in investing in this space, and we're allowing them to attend and interact with the scientists and learn more about the disorder. We're planning for our second awareness week. We've had fundraisers all over the world done by different patients, adding a lot of new families, again, with the technology. There's especially a lot of younger children added, but we are seeing now some older people up to, I think, about 35 years old now, as people are, I think, becoming familiar that the technology exists and there's these advances that they can now get a diagnosis. We're starting to work on our patient registry. This is kind of a thorn in my side because I don't think there's a perfect answer to that, and we're trying to figure out the best place to get that hosted. We're working with our scientific advisory board, and through that we were able to, just for a small organization with only about 150 or so patients worldwide, we were able to get a grant to do mouse models under the NIH Precision Medicine grant that was given to Jackson Labs, able to get funding to do mouse models for 3 variants of the mutation. And that was something where I've just kind of, I think, the saying my mother, who's from the Southeast, always says, you have to be likable to be liked, or something like that. That we've tried to be easy to work with, put our information out there, connect any of the industry people to our experts, and basically let anyone who wants to work in this area know that we're accessible, we're helpful, we'll make whatever arrangements we're capable of making, provide access to our families, that if you want to do research in this area, we're going to make it as easy as we can, serve that up to you, provide recommendations and all of that. And so as a result, and there's a venture capital firm that's looking to invest in this area around rare epilepsies, and there's several companies looking at rare disease, and certainly that's a hot area for investment in rare disease, and trying to connect with some of them, because it's not, for the number of patients we have and the relatively unknown disorder, raising huge sums of money to fund the research ourselves out of our pockets is probably not going to be the most efficient thing that we can do. So I don't know how we are on time, but I want to open it up to any questions, and certainly happy to provide any help I can beyond our story.
As you were pushing forward with some of this testing, did you reach any financial roadblocks, like insurance not covering tests, and how did you go about finding financial resources to help you through some of those roadblocks?
So I think in general we were very lucky. My husband and I both worked and have insurance through work, so we were lucky in that regard to get most everything covered. The timing of it was probably more of the issue, on wanting to test for one thing, then another thing, then another thing. And kind of understanding the pricing of the test. The one-off tests tend to be, at least at that point, and that was obviously, the prices change with the technology, but these tests were costing $1,000 a piece, and the insurance was covering them. Now doing a whole exome sequence, you can do a whole exome sequence with a good analysis, certainly well under $10,000 commercially. And if you do several tests, you're going to run up higher than that. I mean, we ran well above that, and it was covered by insurance. But I think that, to try to get a better outcome, maybe even, better outcome than what we had of having that discussion with the insurance. I mean, I think they depend that the geneticist or whomever knows which one test to select. And that might be true, again, if you're getting into more common diseases, as you get into obscure rare diseases where they've never seen a patient, that they're not going to be selecting that one correct disease to test for the first time. And by doing, kind of nickel and diming yourself $1,000 at a time, that, they're going to be up above that. So certainly looking at it today, I would do whatever I could to get something more comprehensive, and that's still not going to be extraordinarily expensive, and see if insurance can cover it. But there's also lots of organizations, and if there's a toolkit that Global Genes put out that lists a number of organizations that either work with your insurance or perform the sequencing free of charge. I mean, neither we nor our insurance paid for the diagnosis done at TGen, and there's a number of programs that can be done like that. Yes.
How is James doing now, and how are his siblings doing?
So James is doing great. This was actually a couple years ago at the gala. He made it through the whole thing and to the late night after party. He's amazingly, happy, resilient. I mean, it's strange to say he's really healthy. He's probably healthier than the average child, except Mrs. Lincoln, for the fact that he has the seizures. He has severe developmental delays. He's nonverbal. He understands maybe a few words that you speak to him. He walks. His gross motor skills are probably his really strong point, and we were told when he was about 2.5 that he would probably never walk. And he can hike in Yosemite. I mean, you have to hold his hand and help him, and he can be unstable, but he'll hike 5 miles. And walking around is really what kind of gives him the most joy, just looking out the windows, things like that. But he's super happy. He's very social. He loves his siblings. We now, and I may mention, have 5 children. The last 3 that we had, adopted in the last 2 just a few months ago. And he loves being around everyone, the craziness, the noise, and all of that. So, but the big part of that was getting the seizures under control, because he hasn't had seizures. When he's been in those patches of having lots of seizures, it's like night and day in terms of doing that.
When your son was finally diagnosed, did you have any difficulties finding physicians to treat him, or treatments themselves? Any hard time finding treatments?
Well, because it's something new, there are no different treatments. There were no different doctors that we pursued. We've always been seeing a neurologist because of the seizures he'd had since day one. We've pretty much quit seeing the geneticist. I guess that's the way that profession works. But there's nothing really that new or different that we were doing. There's no different treatments. As we've looked at, ultimately the anti-seizure medications he's taking will probably stop working. And as we look at some new compounds that are under development strictly for the seizures, knowing his diagnosis, we certainly are looking at what the specific mechanisms, the anti-seizure mechanism is of that, and to the extent it works directly on the potassium channel, whether that might have the opportunity to do something to his cognitive function as well as just controlling the seizures. Because most of the anti-seizure medications just kind of take you down, and that's not going to improve his cognition if you're doing that. But to the extent there's something that regulates more specifically, that might be useful. And that's a whole avenue that we're pursuing with the foundation in our research, is trying to figure out too how the specifics of this disorder that is fundamentally like a seizure disorder, even though it has these broad consequences, how that might be useful to the general population with seizures, people with other diseases, and that's a really critical thing to try to get research funding.
The reason I ask is that people in, my patients in my organization, support groups and so forth, Once they're diagnosed, they have a very difficult time finding a specialist, in our case rheumatologist, that is willing to even take them as a patient, because there are no treatments available, because they don't know what causes the disease, and it's systemic. So.
And I don't know where they live. I mean, certainly the only thing that I can say to that, I mean, we've generally gone to academic and teaching hospitals, so like at Stanford and UCSF, and I think certainly those practices where their whole compensation basis is different and where their aims of learning more about, more complex disorders and things like that is more related to their mission. I mean, I would certainly think that those institutions, if patients are near them, that they'd find maybe a more open audience than they might at someone that's a more commercially oriented rheumatologist, because particularly with some of the drugs available for garden variety, like rheumatoid arthritis, those physicians can make a lot of money off of just treating patients and prescribing medications that they make margin on.
I'm going to do one more question. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and then we can stay after and ask.
Do you have a sense of the number of people who are in that state of actively looking for a diagnosis?
I don't. There was some work done. I was involved in a campaign for a registry through the NIH. We tried to put together a number, but there's not a good capture for that. There's a lot of kind of estimates. But it also, I think that depends. I mean, and you said actively looking for a diagnosis, which is different than being undiagnosed, or, as I said, my personal view of being kind of poorly diagnosed with just some sort of label, that if you get into all of those categories, and it's certainly, millions of people, but the people who really have no label whatsoever and are actively seeking testing, maybe it's a bit like the unemployment numbers. If people are depressed and don't think there's a solution, they're not out there looking. And I think if you opened a registry and some central repository for that there might be a lot of people coming out of the woodwork. I also have to say it has a bad name, because there's also the, undiagnosed people, if they don't have really severe, obvious symptoms of having some kind of psychological issue of not really being sick.
Okay, sorry, we're going to have to cut the questions off. But let's give her a round of applause for sharing a great story.